This is Unit 2, the United States Manifest Destiny, Unit 2.1, Westward Expansion in the Jacksonian Democracy, specifically looking at Theme 1, Jefferson Purchases Louisiana. The United States is a westward-facing nation at this point. The United States has always been a westward-facing nation. In fact, it goes all the way back to the Proclamation of 1763, in which Britain tried to hold back the American colonists from expanding westward. The British saw it as a policy attempting to keep the military spending in check so the Americans wouldn't interact with the Native Americans and lead to bloodshed. The Americans saw this as a paternalistic move to treat them like children and keeping them from what they felt they deserved. And it led to hurt feelings, and if you remember, it led to tensions with the British Parliament, which in turn led to further tensions after the Tax Acts were passed. After American independence was won, there was really nothing holding these colonists back to move westward. And it's especially true once the Articles of Confederation passed the Northwest Ordinance and the Land Ordinance, which set up a system for statehood, especially here in this Northwest territory. If you remember, the proclamation line was set right here along the Appalachian Mountains. The United States, after independence, had won all of this territory here in what had formerly been the British Empire, all the way to the Mississippi River here in the west, which would have been the West Coast. And if you notice, Louisiana, which is currently held by the Spanish and eventually going to be held by the French, is this territory even further west. What's important is that in 1790, when the Americans won independence, the nation was this large. And then in 1802, a couple of years after 1790 was when the Constitution was written. In 1802, now we have organized states developing. What's really important to note is that the United States did not have this area here, which is New Orleans. All of this valuable land in the West needs to have access to the Mississippi River so that they can get all of their farm goods down either the Ohio River or the Mississippi River and get it out to the world markets. So New Orleans is going to become incredibly important. This idea of westward expansion, let's get back to that for a second, is very important because it focuses the United States away from Europe towards a more American identity. It leads to an intensified nationalism. There's a few different ways to think about nationalism. First, a definition would be an excessive or fanatical devotion to a nation and its interests, often associated with a belief that one's country is superior to all others. Think of this as like patriotism on steroids. Westward expansion is a great example of this because the United States feels that it has this divine mandate, we call it manifest destiny, to take over everything out west. But there's already people there. There's the Native Americans, there's the French, there's the Spanish, which eventually becomes Mexico. The British are also going to be up in Oregon. But we feel the United States felt that it had the right, not just the right, but this divine, God-given privilege to go and take this over. A couple of interesting things do come from westward expansion. Because of this idea of the pioneer, this lone individual that goes off with his or her family and sets up a home front all by themselves. This becomes, in the American mentality, the way that things are done, that you do things by yourself, that you're a self-made person. And it also gives us this idea of the common man, the idea that anybody can go off and be successful, but also that the democracy is built on this idea of a common man, that the common farmer is the real embodiment, the true ideal of the United States. The common man ideology is the basis of the Democratic Republicans or the Jeffersonian Republicans that we saw in the last couple of units. One unfortunate side effect is sectionalism. All the regions agreed, the North and the South, agreed that the United States should expand westward, but it disagreed over the appropriate policies to do so. There's a disagreement between the North and the South and even the West about what the land policy should be. Should there be cheap land policies? Should there be internal improvements? And what kinds of internal improvements? Roads, bridges, railroads eventually, canals. Should the federal national government support industrial development? Should there be support of a tariff? Should there be expansion of slavery out west? We're going to get into all this in future podcasts, more of this in Unit 2.3 and 2.4. Here are the sections, the North and the South. What's interesting to note is that as Northerners moved west, they tended to act like Northerners, and they typically believed in something called free soil. Please note that free soil is different than abolition. Abolition believes that slavery is a moral abhorrence that is absolutely wrong and should be gotten rid of. Free soil is an economic idea. It's the idea that these northern white settlers didn't want to have to compete with slaves, not slaves themselves, but the plantations. So they didn't want slavery in their region so that they could buy up the cheap, so that the white northern settlers could buy up the cheap land. In the South, they wanted slavery to go out west with them because these are typically cotton plantation farmers moving out west trying to take their regional economic system with them. So the North is free soil, the South is going to be slave-based. There are 5 major land acquisitions that you should know. The Louisiana Purchase, which is the center third of the United States. The Oregon Settlement, which is up here. The Texas Revolution, which is Texas. And the Mexican Cession, which actually comes out of the Texas Revolution. The other major land acquisition is the old territory that we got after winning independence. Jefferson is the guy that decided to purchase Louisiana, and it's an interesting decision if we understand who Jefferson is. We talked in the last couple of podcasts about Jefferson being a strict interpreter of the Constitution, and that he wanted a weak federal government and most of the power to be based in the states. He's this democratic Republican ideal that wants to have a strong common man democracy. And yet he still purchased Louisiana, which is nowhere in the Constitution that allows the president to purchase land from another country. He justifies it through loosely interpreting the Constitution. He says that it's simply a treaty. So he is actually violating his core principles of strict interpretation to make this purchase. He purchased the land to make the country stronger, and by proxy, it makes the national government stronger, which is a bit ironic. What's also ironic is Hamilton's reaction to this purchase. Hamilton decried the purchase as Jefferson overstepping his constitutional authority. I find this funny because Hamilton had always been the person that said, yes, let's loosely interpret the Constitution, let's make the federal government stronger. And now he's actually violating his personal beliefs. There's a lesson here, and that is that politicians will change their position based on who's making the decisions. So ideally, as a well-informed citizen, you, the person listening to this video, will be able to analyze an event and interpret it on your own. What is the precedent that Jefferson set? Well, he loosely interpreted the Constitution to make a land purchase. And this is a precedent that future presidents are going to follow. Another side note here, please be careful when using Jefferson and other founding fathers and other founding figures. Quotes can be accurate and still not provide a full context of the action or beliefs that are being held. Good history is made up of multiple corroborating sources, not a single magic bullet quotation. Jefferson, for example, is very famous for saying that it is tyranny to take the sweat and blood of another man's labor, and yet he is the man that owns slaves and literally makes his fortune off of another man's labor. So be careful when it comes to quotes. What are the impacts of Louisiana and the Louisiana Purchase? Well, this is going to give us the American ideals of individualism. As settlers move out to the West, they're going to be individual. It also gives us sectionalism, this conflict between the North and the South. And it's also going to provide democracy, and I'll show you that in just a second. As the nation grows westward, it's focusing its population on moving west. It's looking away from Europe and towards this open land out west. And it does fuel this idea of manifest destiny, this idea that we have a God-given right to move out there, and nationalism. Nationalism is going to be pretty important. But most importantly, it gives us control of the Mississippi River. And this is of vital importance for our economic development, and the Mississippi River is what allows us to even move out west. It allows farm products in the old Northwest area access to world markets. Right here, this is Indiana and Ohio. You can float your goods down the Ohio River, get onto the Mississippi, and out through New Orleans, into the Gulf of Mexico, and into the world markets. There's also more land for the national government to sell and more land for Americans to buy. As Americans move west, democracy spreads into these new territories. Because of this old Northwest and land ordinances, these new states come in as equals to the original 13 states. That's going to be important when it comes to political issues. It's important when it comes to things like the Electoral College and making decisions on laws. We'll get to all that later. This is the time period where we also have universal white male suffrage. The right to vote, also known as suffrage, was originally reserved only for property owners, even in the North. And this cheap Western government sold land meant that more men were now property owners. In fact, so much property was being sold and so many men were eligible for voting that by the 1830s, most states had simply just dropped the property requirement and allowed all white males to vote. This is the idea of franchise, which was given to all white men. That being said, at this time period, all African Americans are specifically being targeted and being disenfranchised, which largely means they can't vote. They're second-class citizens. They're technically citizens, but they don't have the same rights as everybody else. Politics becomes a favorite pastime at this time in history. This is George Caleb Bingham's the county election, which is from the 1830s. And if we look closely, this is what a county election typically would have looked like. A lot of guys are getting around and it becomes a party atmosphere. This guy here has had a few too many drinks. This guy here has definitely had too many drinks, and yet if you look at this guy's eyes, he's obviously carrying this man to go vote. And it just becomes this place where men would gather and they'd talk and they'd have a good time. It's a popular pastime. And Andrew Jackson is the first president that really gets elected as this champion of the common man. So he's the first Western president. He's from Tennessee, and he portrays himself as a common man. He wasn't educated at a higher education institution, and in fact he made fun of his opponent for being one. This is the beginning of an anti-intellectual, anti-elitist strain in American politics, and it has tendrils all the way up into 2012. It's really the main reason why Obama and Romney in 2012 both tried very hard to downplay their Harvard degrees because they didn't want to be seen as intellectual elitist snobs. They wanted to be seen as somebody that could connect to the common man, and it goes all the way back to Andrew Jackson. So again, to review, this idea of Jefferson purchasing Louisiana, the importance is all of the things that happened because we started to focus our American mentality to the West.